Okay, good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday, and welcome to another episode of OP Radio. My name is Matt. I'm a content strategist at OP Labs. We have another great episode lined up for you today. Before we get into it, a brief disclaimer. Speakers on OP Radio are speaking in their personal capacities and not for their respective companies. To the extent there are any, do not rely on any forward-looking statements made during this episode. And remember, OP is a governance token, not an investment, and nothing in this episode is or should be construed as investment advice. Well, I wasn't lying, guys. We do have a really special episode today with a really great guest. Can't wait to talk to him. So without further ado, let's introduce him. Dan, good morning. How you doing? You want to say hello to the folks on OP Radio?
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming, sir. We're happy to have you. So Dan, in addition to being the founder of Farcaster, which we're definitely going to get into, maybe you could give people just an overview of your background in life before crypto, if there was such a thing.
Sure. So I'm originally from the East Coast, moved to San Francisco in 2013 and spent the first year while I was there working for a SaaS company and fell in love with Bitcoin, ended up working at Coinbase and that was there for 5 years. Took some time off in between Coinbase and starting Farcaster, reconnected with a colleague of mine from Coinbase, Varun Srinivasan, and we started working on what is now Farcaster in October of 2020. So just hit the 3-year mark.
Nice. Another member of the Coinbase Mafia. There's a lot of you out there.
Yeah. Turns out if you're one of the only legitimate companies in early crypto, you have a lot of people who end up going on to do other things in crypto later.
Yeah, imagine that. Okay, so Dan, for folks who might not be familiar, we do have a crypto audience, but we also make our best attempt to make OP Radio as accessible to anyone and everyone, whether or not they have experience with crypto or not. So could you just, with that in mind, give us an explanation of what Farcaster is?
Sure. So Farcaster is a social network, just like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So from a user's perspective, it's actually just about the people and the people that they find on there, the content that people that post. But I think what's under the hood is what makes it a little different. And I think that's important to start with because, for the last couple of years, I think we've been emphasizing the decentralized nature of Farcaster and the fact that it's built as a protocol. But the reality is that doesn't actually get people to sign up. Yeah, you might have some ideological people, especially crypto natives, who might find that interesting. But if I'm trying to pitch someone, in an elevator at a coffee shop of why they should use Farcaster, it's actually a lot more about what types of people are using it and what are they using it for. So I think that is something that we need to do a better job of, and so kind of trial ballooning it here. But if we actually want to dig into why is Farcaster different, fundamentally Farcaster isn't built by a company is maybe the wrong term. It's not owned by any one individual or company. It is actually a protocol in the same way that email is a protocol or the World Wide Web is a protocol. And what that means is it means that anyone who has an idea for a new app or service built on top of Farcaster is able to go and permissionlessly do that. In the same way that prior to kind of Gmail coming along, people used Yahoo Mail or Hotmail or hosted their own mail server. And when Google decided that they wanted to build Gmail, they didn't have to ask permission. They were just able to build an email service. And based on the kind of merits of that email service, people chose to use it or not. I think that is the fundamental difference between something like Farcaster and Twitter. And I think that's what Varun and I were really excited to work on, back in 2020. And I think 3 years in, we're finally at a place where it's not 100% perfect, but we're pretty much there in that anyone can use Farcaster as long as they have a little bit of ETH, OP ETH actually to be specific, and an internet connection. And after that, there's a kind of choose your own adventure of how you want to use Farcaster. And I'm happy to get into the specifics on that.
I think that's really smart, Dan, what you said about, everybody has varying levels of interest in decentralization, as you said. And so just making the Farcaster pitch easy for anyone and enticing for anyone to understand based on who is using it and what are they using it for. And then you get all these decentralized benefits on the back end. But yeah, I do think that's sort of a tough sales pitch, the decentralization aspect. I am curious though, I think maybe maybe that decentralized aspect does end up affecting what types of people are on it and what they use it for, right?
Yeah, like I said, I think early on, the early users who find it interesting are early adopters, ideologically motivated, whatever set of reasons. I see a bunch of familiar faces here in the space right now of some of the early users. But I think the tangible benefits of decentralization apply to two distinct groups. So the first is developers, right? So Twitter actually is a great example of this. Early days of Twitter, there was no official Twitter mobile client. There were multiple mobile clients, Tweety, Twitterific, Tweetbot, and many others. And the idea was Twitter had an open API, they had a website, but if you wanted to build your own app, you could just go do that. And so you had all of this innovation that happened within the Twitter ecosystem. Hashtags were invented by users and other clients, retweets, quote tweets, at replies actually were originally not native. So a lot of what we take for granted in terms of Twitter's product today actually were invented by users and third-party clients in the early days of Twitter. And then right around 2014, Twitter was going public, and they basically made a conscious decision to severely limit the API and what you could do with it. And so, kind of overnight, you had all these developers who had put blood, sweat, and tears into building these awesome apps have the rug pulled out from under them. And a similar story happened with Facebook. Facebook actually, had this whole platform strategy prior to kind of mobile. Zynga being the most prominent example of a company that built a multi-billion-dollar company on top of Facebook's platform, and then company had a strategic pivot. APIs got limited. What you could do on mobile was more limited because of Apple, and that platform dried up overnight. And so I think for developers, they've been burned over the last 10 years of building on these centralized social platforms. They know the power of the distribution that you can get from them and the fact that users actually want to use alternative clients and experiences for social platforms, but they are not going to go invest the time in, very few people are going to invest the time in building businesses because they know that their terms of service change or a new owner of a social network change away from a significantly different API set of APIs. So with Farcaster, the ironclad guarantee is that as a developer, you're building an app. Any users you end up getting to use your app, you have a sovereign relationship between you as the developer and those users. There's no kind of like third party that can kind of come in and snip that connection. And so I think that's really important. And so that sets a foundation so that developers are interested in building on the Farcaster, protocol. But that's not sufficient because ultimately what developers care about is users, right? So just because you have good technology, if you don't have any users, they're not going to do the hard work to bring the users to the protocol. Otherwise, they would just not build on a protocol. They would build a centralized social network. So I think that's a challenge that we have yet to solve is how do we get to, millions of daily active users on the protocol, which at that point, I think then you have a really compelling value proposition for developers. The second group that really benefits from the decentralization is the kind of, call it creator, influencer, person with an audience. And most of the time that works well on centralized social media, whether it's Twitter or YouTube. You can go build an audience, build a living from that. But every so often, that relationship gets snipped by the kind of platform. So there is no recourse if Twitter or YouTube wakes up one day and just says, you know what, you're suspended. There's no way for you to go sue them in court and say, hey, I actually spent 10 years building my audience here. I've got millions of subscribers. I at least want to give one more video to tell them what happened and where they can find me. Nope. So the kind of monopoly power that the platforms have over the social graph that they have built is really disempowering, especially if kind of creating content or an audience is essentially your primary way of making a living. Contrast that to something like email newsletters and then popular tool Substack. You use Substack, you build up several 100,000 subscribers. If Substack decides they don't want to work with you for whatever reason, and they usually actually are pretty good about not deplatforming people, but let's just assume that for whatever reason they say, hey, you're no longer able to use Substack. People would think it would be ridiculous if Substack withheld the email addresses that you had worked hard to kind of earn for your newsletter. They allow you to export via a CSV, you move it over to MailChimp or a service that you host yourself, and you can be up and running with your email newsletter same day on a different service provider. Impossible with Twitter or YouTube. Under a system like Farcaster or protocol like Farcaster, that relationship between the kind of creator and their audience is, sovereign in the sense that doesn't even belong to the creator. It belongs to the person following the creator. But what's important is no one can muck with that relationship other than the individual themselves. And so I think both of those are very valuable in the long run propositions, but the harsh reality is that doesn't actually solve a problem for most people today. It doesn't actually attract daily active users because daily active users don't run into either of those problems. And so you have a bit of a chicken and the egg in that you need the daily active users to sufficient scale to actually attract developers and want them to build new apps and services on top of the protocol. And then as you build up the total number of daily active users, you start to attract or homegrown creators with large audiences where that relationship being sovereign, that's important. So those are the value propositions, but I definitely think we're not out of the woods in terms of having cracked the way to solve for them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great explanation there, Dan. And I really want to just emphasize, the increased sovereignty, not just for the users, but for the developers themselves. To provide just a specific example for folks, I do social media and occasionally I look at analytics, and, the Twitter analytics tool isn't that robust. And so I went to a third party and, looking for some specific analytics. And after signing up for this service, turns out they really couldn't offer much more than Twitter was. And I just really wasn't impressed. And I sat back and wondered, why is this the case? And the theory is, I think it's because precisely what you said, Dan, which is, why would you build a business on top of, or that relies on Twitter when they can basically, shut down the API or make a change without telling you? So you're going to pour all this time and energy into this project, into this business, and then have the rug pulled out from under you without any notice. It just doesn't make any sense. And so I think as a result, there's a lack of innovation in the space because it's a closed source system and you're at the whim and mercy of a third party. And, I like this metaphor of like, why would you build a home on land you don't own that someone could take away from you? It just doesn't really make sense, right?
Totally. Yeah. I think people are willing to deal with centralized systems and as long as they trust them. But I think the significant investment, you need to de-risk it. And so you need to have kind of the most sovereign set of property rights that are possible. And I think in the case of, what's made the US so successful is you have strong property rights. And so people are willing to invest on kind of long-term horizons, knowing that the work that they do can't be taken away from them. Contrast it to maybe some other countries. And then I think the same thing applies for social networks, in that I do think if you can kind of crack the audience size challenge, you do end up in a world where, of course, creators or anyone trying to build an audience or a developer would much prefer to be building on a system where they have that sovereign relationship rather than a system where it's effectively they're not even renting it from a centralized platform. They're using it at the kind of convenience and whim of the centralized platforms. And if the centralized platform decides they don't like you on any given day, you lose that hard-earned audience.
Yeah, you only exist and operate at their mercy, which is not a good position to be in. Certainly one I would not envy and don't envy. Dan, I want to circle back to something you said and just push back just a little, because I think you're very right, and I understand where you're coming from with building up the user base, because I agree with you. Most users don't care about the decentralized aspect. They want something that's easy to use where the people are. That makes total sense. I just have this thought, and I'm curious what you think. I think we're sort of experiencing sort of these downstream trickle effects of this closed source system. And I think it has affected the experience of the platform itself from a user perspective. So I just would say that, yeah, I totally get what you mean about, building for the users. I think that's the right approach. I just think that maybe we're experiencing some deleterious consequences that the user may or may not be aware of what's causing this, but it does affect the experience on the app. Any thoughts there?
Well, I'm a bit of a contrarian here in that I think X has improved year over year, despite all the hand-wringing from the commentariat. I think there are definitely instances where things may be worse, or individuals, your mileage may vary. But as someone who is directly competing for attention that people spend on X, I think it's gotten harder for us year over year. So I always find it interesting as people kind of give me their opinion, and then it's like, well, I'm literally building an alternative, and I'm telling you, it's getting harder to get people to spend time outside of X. But I think that said, if the thing that the new regime with Twitter has opened the aperture for people, it's that prior to the current ownership at Twitter, you actually kind of only had, and this is a kind of generalization, but right-wing extreme people were the ones that wanted to find new social networks. And Farcaster by no means is right-wing or extreme. If anything, we've been accused by Vitalik himself of being too polite. So, or another, I guess, backhanded compliment was that Farcaster's kind of like Christian rap. So we can get into that. But I think generally, one thing I was really conscious of when we were kind of rolling out the initial beta is the last thing I wanted Farcaster to be labeled as or attract were the group of people that were particularly interested in decentralized social circa 2021. And I think what happened with the ownership change at Twitter is it completely changed the conversation around decentralized social media, because it now became a universal thing, right? It went from being, oh, only kind of right-wing extreme people need to find a home, everyone else can use Twitter, to, oh, turns out when the centralized system, as soon as someone you don't like is running that system, now all of a sudden decentralized social media is actually an imperative. And I think you've seen attempts that are kind of both within the crypto sphere and then outside the crypto sphere for building decentralized social media. So I think as a macro trend, there is wind in the sails for people realizing that, maybe we should be moving the online public square to something kind of a little bit more neutral or protocol based. But I think the harsh reality is that no one, including Facebook, the company that is so successful from just like growing daily active users, they had this huge splashy launch in July with Threads, got up to 100 million people onboarding within whatever a week, but it's basically dead, right? Like, so even Facebook has not been able to kind of figure out a way to crack user growth in terms of this generally something that looks more like Twitter, right? Like, so Twitter, what is it? It's a one-to-many social network. It's a unidirectional follow model. Contrast that to like LinkedIn or Facebook. It's like you have to opt in, both of you, to connect. Twitter, you just follow someone, right? So it's more akin to something that's like broadcast, like YouTube or RSS or any of these kind of other types of technologies. And no one has actually cracked the how do you sustainably grow daily active users in a decentralized way. And so I think I'm optimistic. Otherwise, I wouldn't be working on it. But I do think that there's a long road ahead in terms of figuring out the right set of user experience and value proposition that convinces. I'm not even asking for like a normie person, like my mom, who's not that technically sophisticated. I'm saying like a tech sophisticated person, or hell, even crypto Twitter. As much as people talk decentralized, they act centralized, right? Like they are like, oh, this is how we're going to onboard the next few billion users, or we need consumer crypto. Like, I don't know how many points of view I've seen shared about consumer crypto on Twitter. And it's just, I just find that deeply ironic. It's like, yeah, maybe you have a person post something on Mirror or Paragraph, but the reality is that most of the people who like to opine about consumer crypto spend most of their time on Twitter. So the consumer crypto is not going to happen until someone organically figures out a way to get those people, the kind of like next group of early adopters for decentralized social, to actually be using decentralized social every day. And so that's actually what we're spending our time on, is like, how do we actually figure out the right set of kind of product features, value proposition to get people to actually use decentralized social rather than talk about it.
Yeah, of course, the irony here I am criticizing Twitter or X. I refuse to use the latter name, but and I'm doing so on the platform itself. So that kind of goes to your point, Dan. Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying, Dan, is that the user base is the moat. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It's habit. It's the existing set of people who are using something. That collective action is extremely hard to break, because you can be principled and stop using it. I mean, I'll give Vitalik credit. Vitalik has what, 5 million followers on Twitter. and he's effectively moved to exclusively using decentralized social. He uses Farcaster, he uses a couple of the other decentralized social apps. That's a true believer, right? Like that's someone who's talking decentralized and acting decentralized. I think he even uses a free and open source version of Android, like full stack believes what he's saying. Whereas I think there are a lot of other people in the space that, they like talking about it, and I think part of it is it's their job, or that's what they're doing for their career. But they certainly don't like act it, which is fine. To be fair, I don't want to sound like bitter. It's actually it's a tough problem to crack, right? It's completely rational. And here's a good example. There is a Farcaster app called Abura, permissionlessly built by Bill Z in the Farcaster community, that effectively offers Twitter Spaces, Clubhouse like functionality. I think that the tough reality for Bill is it works well for Farcaster, but for something like this, OP Radio, your existing audience is on Twitter. That's where they're spending time. And when you go live with OP Radio, you have real estate at the top of all of the people following the Optimism accounts, which several 100,000 people following it, Twitter app. So I think that is, you can get mad all you want about it, but the harsh reality there is that's distribution, and that's what people want. And so I think we are just going to be relentlessly focused over the next year, now that the kind of fundamental system actually is permissionless. It's taken us 3 years to get there. Is we need to drive growth, and if we can get growth in the ecosystem, everyone benefits from that. The existing users who've worked hard to kind of build up an early following get benefit from that. Developers now have more users to kind of go advertise their apps, or kind of try to convince to use their apps. And then I think it also just starts to become a credible alternative to the centralized platforms, right? If you can get a critical mass of people within crypto Twitter to start using something like Farcaster, then it's no longer crypto Twitter. It's just, it's like crypto social or crypto Farcaster, whatever you want to call it. But the point being is, that is the hard problem. And I think it's very easy for protocols to want to focus on the shiny bells and whistles features, because you have complete control over what you're writing in your code. You don't have control over convincing consumers, who tend to be pretty fickle, to actually use an app every day.
I just want to say, Dan, I really appreciate this sober approach to the problems in front of us. I think you're taking a very clear-eyed look at the landscape, obviously as embedded as you are and as close to it as you are. And I think that's good. I think we need to be more honest and have these more candid conversations about the real problems. Because if we don't, how are we ever going to overcome them, right? So I do truly appreciate that. Speaking of which, a lot of progress to be made still. I agree with that. But maybe we can talk about some of the wins that Farcaster has racked up so far. Like how many apps have been built using the protocol to date?
Yeah, you kind of mentioned that before, and I went and looked. I think app is a pretty broad term, right? So you can kind of think of it as like a full-fledged client that kind of mimics the experience of Twitter. I see JC in the audience. He's built one with FarQuest, and they have a kind of client, I think, called Cast. Who else is in the audience here? Brian Kim is actually building something called Tiles, which is kind of tiles.cool. FarQuest is far.quest, I think. And then tiles.cool is kind of like a Pinterest, Instagram, Visco style image viewer for Farcaster. Again, both of these being permissionlessly built. And I think both cases, I only found out that these folks were building these clients after the clients had shipped, which is always, that's like the best part of working on Farcaster, is when someone just kind of drops a new project they've been working on and I had no idea about it. It just that gets me to want to do another day, another week, another month, in terms of just keep moving the ball forward. But yeah, I think probably on the order, if I was to guess, of somewhere between 50 and 100 different kind of apps, experiments, things. And I would say there's probably about a dozen that are more serious or have had prolonged development. It's funny, I actually see Fabricio in here, who's well known in the Twitter world because of Typefully. And I think there are a lot of people on Farcaster who are very excited about the idea of having Typefully, which allows you to kind of compose and schedule really nice, thoughtful threads on Twitter, to have Farcaster support. So happy to DM afterwards if you need any point in the right direction. But I think generally what's cool about Farcaster is all the API docs are open source and kind of there. We have a tutorial that you can actually get up and running with Farcaster without having to use any centralized APIs. There are centralized APIs available, but those are completely opt-in. you can be in a completely sovereign stack without having ever touched anything that the core team has kind of built within, call it 10 minutes. And I think that is the developer experience that we think is really important, because that offers a kind of credible option if you ever get frustrated with one of the centralized providers. And so the developer experience has come a long way. Last year definitely was not that. And so the team, that's actually been probably where we've been spending most of our time for the last year. And now we're shifting. Basically, the whole kind of core team is now focused on growth, and it's specifically growing the ecosystem in a way that is both not focused on, like, well, I guess focus is the wrong term. It's growing it with quality, right? So that it's a little squishy, but the idea is we don't want to just go get user numbers up and then it turns out there's a bunch of like bots on the network, because that just is not useful for anyone. So we kind of have a couple of ways of measuring it internally of like, okay, what do we believe is the most intellectually honest number of real people using the protocol every day. And so at this point, we're roughly on the order of something around 4,000 people using it daily. And that's both within kind of our client, Warpcast, and then other clients. And the kind of multiples on that weekly and monthly. But I think where we are, it's like probably on the order of about 30,000 people have signed up. Almost 10,000 people have actually paid since we went permissionless a month ago. So it's $7 to join Farcaster, which is a little unconventional for social networks, because usually the whole point is like grow as fast as possible and get the user numbers up. But our view is that just attracts kind of like bots. And our goal is to just be intellectually honest. And so every time we have a sign up, we view it as pretty valuable, because someone is choosing to spend $7 to access the network. And so I think if we continue on the sign up rate that we have, we will end up having, call it closer to 100,000 signups within the next 12 months, which would be exciting. We want to significantly increase that. And so that's kind of like where the team's focused right now.
Very cool. So I think what I'm hearing is, you think it's safe to say though that the quality of those users is a bit more reliable than something, say, Twitter, which also, you probably saw there have been a lot of rumors of Twitter maybe instigating or initiating some sort of payment mandatory. And my understanding is that's to try to ensure that these are real users. So yeah, it sounds like, the obviously numbers wise, not as high of a user base, but the quality is higher.
Yeah, so that's our that's our belief, is that the quality is higher. However, I don't think that's sufficient. So I think you need both quality and quantity in order to kind of make it relevant for people, especially for developers, right? Because they are keyed off of, if they're trying to go raise a venture round, they're going to be keyed off of the growth that they have. And the harsh reality is that investors are pattern matching off of Web2 social networks, which is all about DAO and WOW and MAO. These are, daily active users, weekly active users, monthly active users. And so you just need quantity of people. And so I think we need some balance of that. I also think the way to think about growth is, right now, the way to kind of sign up, you have to pay. Most people who are interested are still interested in crypto. I think we have yet to also figure out how do we grow beyond crypto natives. And that's pretty critical, because I actually think that the size of going back to this just like brutal reality, I don't think the size of the crypto native consumer app population is more than 100,000 people. Like, I actually think it's actually far fewer. And if anything, Farcaster's probably made a lot of progress already onboarding those people. And I think people don't want to talk about that, because then it makes their company app, whatever, feel like this is an insurmountable problem. That said, I'm quite comfortable living in an environment where people think that the category is dead or is not that big, having spent 5 years at Coinbase, because the first couple of years at Coinbase, other than maybe the first like 6 months I was there when Bitcoin was still a thing in 2014, people just kept saying, "Why are you still working at like a Bitcoin company? Like, Bitcoin's dead." And then 2017 came around, and Coinbase went from 10 million in revenue to $1 billion in revenue, and 25 million customers, and all of a sudden crypto became a very hot thing. And then quickly within 18 months, it kind of went back to being not cool again. And so if anything I learned at Coinbase is these are the periods where if you can make as much progress when things are, just not cool, there's not a lot of user growth, when things inevitably switch back and there's some cycle where people are actually excited about crypto again, that's going to be the opportunity where maybe the category of consumer crypto goes from 100,000 potential people to go after to a million or 10 million. And then if we go through another cycle, maybe it's that million or 10 million gets up to 100 million. So I think the fortunate thing is Varun and I both had that experience at Coinbase, and we both have a long-term vision for how we want to build Farcaster. We've also raised enough money that we can be prudent about just taking a long-term approach. But that said, I don't think we want to kind of have this, whether you call it copium or hopium, of like assuming that some price cycle that happens in the future is going to be the reason we have user growth. Like I think we wake up every day. The first thing I do is I look at the trailing 7-day Dow number, and if that's going up, okay, how can I make it go up more? And if it's flat or has gone down, it's like, well, what's happening, and how can we resolve that? And so I think if we can do as much work as we can to accelerate daily active user growth within the Farcaster ecosystem over the next 12 to 18 months, that is actually the single best thing that we can do for both Farcaster, but I also do think it's actually really useful for the broader crypto space, right? Every Farcaster user is an Ethereum wallet that is online. And so you can kind of think of those 30,000 Farcaster users are 30,000 wallets that actually have a live address on, OP mainnet, for example. And those 4,000-ish daily active users, those are 4,000 people who are waking up every day. And when they use the app, that's actually a daily active user of that chain, in the sense that that wallet is now live and potentially interacting with things, minting things, et cetera. And so I think a world where we're able to kind of crack user growth and daily active usage, that's just a huge boon for anyone building on blockchains, because now all these users, they don't even need to be onboarded. They have already been onboarded, in that they have a wallet, and then they have a feed that people are potentially sharing things that they can do on chain. And then they're only 1 or 2 taps away from actually doing that thing on chain.
Yeah. Dan, I want to ask you about your take on the current social media landscape. Do you think it is a winner take all sort of competition? I wonder if being who you are, I wonder if you could, cast into the future, look into your crystal ball for us. Where do you see the future, and what is the long-term goal? Do these platforms need to, it would seem in the case of Twitter that it is sort of a winner take all, or do you see a future where it's sort of split amongst multiple networks?
So I think if you look at the kind of mature state of Web 2 social, it is not a winner take all in the sense of usage. And there are several networks, and even ones that got created in the last few years, with TikTok being the kind of prominent example here, that have hundreds of millions of daily active users. But if you look at actual market cap and monetization, it's Facebook, and then everything else is just kind of like a rounding error, right? It's like Twitter is now internally valued at 20 billion. Snap is hovers around 20 billion. Pinterest, and I think the only other, you have 2 scaled social networks outside of the Meta portfolio, is you have TikTok, which is kind of interesting in that they had to spend billions of dollars in customer acquisition, because ByteDance, the parent company, had that money to spend. But they were able to will something into existence, which is actually quite impressive. I'm pretty conflicted on TikTok. I think it personally should be banned, but I think the execution has just been unparalleled. And then the other one is YouTube, which Google has just been really bad at building consumer social products. And it just so happened that I think YouTube has been the one area of their consumer product base, in otherwise what I think is a pretty stagnant product portfolio, that has just gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think YouTube is, A, as a monetization, B, it's a way creators earn money. But I think YouTube is the only other kind of at scale and well monetized social network. So I think in terms of, if you're just trying to get usage numbers, sure, like, you can go build a social network. It's still really hard. But I think if I was to guess, the monetization will probably follow that same power law, and that there will be one decentralized social network or protocol that has better monetization, just because of that power law dynamic. With that said, you may actually still see the subscale ones in terms of monetization still monetize better than Web 2 because by definition, anything in I'm specifically talking about the decentralized social that are kind of crypto native. I'm personally not very bullish on the kind of like non-crypto native decentralized social. I basically don't think that there's any version of monetization that's significant. Like they serve a purpose, but I think that it's kind of more like desktop Linux. Like it's just never going to be a mainstream consumer thing. Whereas in a world where you can make a strong assumption that every user has a crypto wallet that is like fundamentally attached to their social experience, the ability to monetize in a way that consumers actually like, because it's probably going to be transaction based, is much higher. And so in a world where average revenue per user for Facebook is on the order of $200 a year for people in North America and just like US and Canada. It's a little less in Europe, but for the most part, the wealthiest consumers who the advertisers actually want to go target for Facebook are people in North America. And so if you think of $200 per year per user from an advertising based for the best social network in Web 2, I actually think you can achieve some kind of proxy for that across a lot of different social apps in kind of like crypto and Web3, because rather than having to make money on ad views, you actually have the ability to take a cut of transactions, right? So whether that's Zora, I see, Johnny Mac, nonlinear.eth, who's working on Fabric, and they have a new product that just came out today that's a subscription product. But I think those types of products that the social networks can integrate are going to allow monetization at a much higher rate. And that's actually a really good thing, because that means then you can actually have a network that only, it's still really impressive, 10 million people on it that monetizes that at a high enough rate that it can be a viable independent business. And so I'm optimistic that once the Web3 social daily active usage puzzle has been cracked, the monetization rate is going to be significant enough that you actually will see a lot of developers want to build for it. Because in a world where Web 2, you had to have 100 million daily active users before it became a serious business. Maybe in crypto and Web 3, it could be 10 million or even 1 million daily active users that you could monetize at a significant enough rate.
Very interesting. So I just want to restate that in sort of simple terms. So the way I understand it is, yeah, okay, so you may have a fewer users total, but because of the higher monetization rate, you could still consider that a big success.
Totally. So here's like an interesting other one. So Facebook monetizes rest of world. So everyone outside of like the kind of like US, Europe, and I forget exactly what other, they have one other region that they call out, but just like every other country in the world where basically people are poorer, and they don't, the advertising ecosystem is not as significant. I think they monetize at a rate of like $12 per user per year. So it's still pretty good, but like Farcaster does $7 per user per year as a protocol. So anyone joining around the world, if you're paying $7, we're already like on the path to monetizing at least at the base rate that Facebook can do for everyone. Obviously, we're not even close to something like $200 a year for US. But my point being is that if you can actually find the group of people globally that monetize at a rate of, like, I'm just going to pick a number, $50 per year, and this is in aggregate, and if that's the addressable market for developers, I think you'll start to attract a lot of developers, because like that's real money. And so I think that's what I spend time kind of like shower thought thinking is like, how do you crack the daily active user problem enough that now developers actually have a way to make money? And I don't know if people actually talk about this enough in crypto, in the sense that like very few developers are going to stick around and just work on something purely for altruistic or open source reasons. And the people who do, bless them, like they really are the foundational part of everything that we do in software, not just crypto. But I think that the single best way to actually get great new consumer experiences and actually push the space forward is you make developers money. That's what the App Store has been phenomenal for over the last 10 years, despite the 30% tax and all the restrictions, is people build for the App Store because the App Store gives them users, and users that they can make money from. And in doing that, you have these incredible experiences. And yes, you have some other ones that are maybe more, call it surveillance capitalism or whatever, but then you do get Signal, and you do get WhatsApp that also has Signal's level of encryption for free. And so I think that is the mentality that we need, is that it's like, if you actually make developers money, you're actually going to pull in that many more talented people building in the space, which is going to push the space forward.
I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I mean, altruism is a great thing. And as you said, bless all these builders that do build out of altruism. But I don't think it's compelling value proposition. And I don't think we should appeal to people's altruism. I think we should show them the benefits and then allow them to opt in. Okay, so Dan, other than this like decentralized permissionless aspect, this sovereign portable social graph, those in my mind are the biggest benefits to a decentralized protocol like Farcaster. Is there anything else you want to touch on before we move on?
No, that's good for now. I think we should just keep going. I know you had a bunch of other questions.
Yeah, no, not too many more. We're close to wrapping up, but I gotta hit on how you arrived in the Optimism ecosystem, why you chose the OP stack. So maybe you could just explain the thinking, the move to L2, and then eventually your decision to come to OP mainnet.
Yeah, so I think the honest answer was, last year we kind of were like, L2s don't seem like they're far enough ahead, and we took a kind of pass through things, and we were like, you know what, in order for this to kind of be taken seriously, we have to be on ETH-L1. And we were going to deal with these huge gas costs and expense. And we were like, you know what, it's fundamentally a perception thing, is that if Farcaster goes and does an L2, we're not going to be taken seriously. And everything changed for us after two things. One, I think Base joining the OP stack and kind of putting a lot of weight behind it, I think started to change people's minds. And then I think also Zora kind of saying, hey, which I think they had been, I would hate to accuse them of being snooty, but they were like ETH-L1, like that's where the real mints are. They had never gone to a couple of other chains. And for them to actually start deploying across OP as the kind of second place that they were willing to put what they would call provenance, I think that was really impactful for us to say, we should take another look. And I think we did a little bit more of our homework. And in the world where we started looking at L2s, it was just clear for us Optimism was like the right place, in the sense that the types of people building apps similar to Farcaster were already starting to build on Optimism. Paragraph is a good example. Mirror, like these kind of more consumer crypto, less about being a speculative financial asset and more about, how can you use blockchains as computers that can make commitments, to use a Chris Dixon phrase. That seemed to start to be a Schelling point around Optimism. So it just was a very clear case at that point. I think the other thing that I really think is important is Optimism has a strong commitment to open source. And I think that was one of the reasons originally, and not that changed, but I think one of the reasons we wanted to be on ETH originally is this idea of like credible neutrality that Vitalik talks about. And I think where Optimism is headed, and especially spending more time talking with Jing and Liam and a couple others, like our belief is that the OP ecosystem is going to be the closest thing to ETH-L1 in terms of vibe, credible neutrality over the next few years. And I think it's fine if you're building something different, right? If I was building like maybe like a game, I might be willing to take some of those trade-offs. But I think if you're actually thinking about like the broader ecosystem and really focusing on this idea of like, what is the spiritual successor to ETH in the L2 ecosystem, is clear to me. There's Optimism.
Yeah, and if you are building a game, you can build it on Red Rock. Shout out to the Lattice team. They just spun up a game-focused OP chain. So that option is also available to you. But thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply that you can't build a game. My point is that I think one of the core foundations of how Optimism is building is one of the shining examples for why we picked it.
No, absolutely. Point taken. I just wanted to give a shout out to them. Some exciting news that just dropped recently. Speaking of alpha, Dan, I'm wondering what you'd be willing to share with the folks listening on what the future roadmap for Farcaster looks like. I know you stay very busy. What are you comfortable sharing? What's the current focus as far as the product is concerned?
Yeah, so we have a big focus on growing daily active users. And our current focus for that is channels, which, going back to the original thing when we were saying, it's like, what is Farcaster? So Farcaster is a social network that feels like Twitter, but is increasingly pulling in elements from other social networks that kind of, rather than feeling like one giant group chat, which can kind of be intimidating for a new user screaming into the void, there are cozier spaces and smaller spaces where you can find other like-minded individuals. So in the case of channels, you can think of them as kind of like subreddits, or Twitter, I guess, has a feature called communities, which is kind of there, but I don't think has ever taken off. But the idea is it's grouping people around a shared interest, and that interest could be a general topic like fitness or dogs or F1 racing, or it can be a hyper specific interest like, I don't know, Ethereum virtual machine or retro PGF or one of these like very crypto native topics. And the thinking is give the kind of people who are most active in one of those channels some amount of quality control. So if you think about like one of the reasons hashtags don't really work on Twitter is that no one can kind of like manage a hashtag. It's like anyone can kind of participate. So yes, it's democratic, but it's tragedy of the commons in the sense that spam tends to happen there. Whereas I think our vision with channels is it's a little closer to something like a subreddit where, and I hate to use the term mod, but I think it's the simplest way to explain it, is we have a concept called channel leads. And the idea is give the channel leads over time a set of tools that allow them to kind of curate their space and set the set of rules that allow for quality discussion and kind of really showcase whatever's happening in that space around that topic. And the other important thing is our goal with channels is actually to have it be a primitive that is on chain, so that even in a world where Farcaster is no longer satisfying the requirements or kind of needs for that given on-chain community, it's easy to fork out. So you would just have that primitive on OP mainnet, and then you could point it to some new tool that might not even be related to Farcaster. And I think that is a great check on Farcaster in making sure that we are thinking about user problems all the time rather than like what benefits Farcaster, which that should be the thing that benefits Farcaster. But the idea is allowing people exit, I think, is a really powerful alignment strategy for building great experiences. So that's where we're focused on.
Yeah, I think people really like that curated experience. I think Twitter's attempt at this was the For You tab. So, the For You, Twitter's equivalent would be the For You tab, which, somehow the algorithm is recommending content to you and making it appear on your timeline that it thinks you'll be interested in. Whereas with the Farcaster channels, you're opting in, you're expressing your interest in this topic.
Exactly.
But Dan, to be clear, there's still that opportunity for sort of, discovery in the regular feed. Is that right?
Yeah. So, and I think this is failing on our part. So I think we need to make it clearer. So anytime you post on a channel, it actually just flows home to the home feed. So like people will see it, but you can kind of think of it as what we're trying to make it as a non-cringe hashtag, and a hashtag that doesn't run into the tragedy of the comments problem with spam. But effectively, the goal is actually it's people self-select into these categories to find other people on the network who have also self-selected into those categories. But in a way, it's not meant to kind of like, oh, only those people. It's like people who choose to follow you, you might end up getting exposed to something. So we need to do a much simpler and better job of this. But long run, if we can actually just make it so that when people kind of pick a channel, they're getting a little bump in terms of their distribution and to people who find that topic interesting, assuming there's some level of quality, that's the product experience we need to get to.
Yeah, and it's smart of you to recognize the fact that hashtags, for whatever reason, are cringe. I agree with that. I don't know what it is. For me, it feels very advertising. I feel like I'm sort of being beaten over the head with something. So yeah, I think that's a wise choice to recognize the error there and go a different way. I think we're getting close to wrapping up here, Dan. I do want to end on somewhat of a lighter note. There was a meme that went viral on Farcaster recently. The meme is wow, wow. I wonder if you could maybe explain the origins of this meme and what it means to you.
Yeah, so we've had a influx of new users to Farcaster who I think if you think about when you join a new social network, you bring potentially norms in from other places you've used the internet. And I think some of the people are coming in and maybe just kind of replying to any cast on the network, a lot of them for me, in a way to kind of fake activity in hopes of, I don't know, some future reward. And so rather than
like copy pasta almost.
Yeah, and I think, look, part of it is people are paying $7. So I actually want to start from a place of good intention, or people actually want to learn. And so what I've been trying to do is, rather than kind of, mark these people as like spam or something like that, which again doesn't happen at the protocol, but would happen within our client, just try to educate people. And so I've been really trying to experiment with this. And so I mentioned to someone who had responded to, I was asking for like OpenAI's Dev Days predictions, and they responded with wow wow, which was all spelled as one word. And I kind of responded with, I have a little macro that's like, hey, this is a low effort reply. Please be thoughtful about replying. Use a like if you want to kind of indicate happiness. And I think some of the Farcaster OGs found that kind of funny, and they kind of turned it into a meme, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. And so we've since embraced it. So that user has now spawned. If you do mention wow wow on Warpcast, we replace the like button with a wow wow button. And so it is I think, one of our few kind of uniquely homegrown cultural artifacts that has now started to spill out onto Twitter. So if you search for wow wow on Twitter, it's basically Farcaster people responding to things on Twitter with wow wow. So yeah, I think our goal is to see if Vitalik will say wow wow, but it would be cringe to ask him to do it. He has to do it on his own.
Yeah, and I don't want to destroy this meme. I think sometimes a meme is like, it exists in the aether, and if you sort of, if you beat a dead horse, if you describe it too much, you run the risk of destroying it. But I can't help myself because I find this so fascinating and hilarious. And isn't there a bit of irony, Dan, in replying to low effort replies by copy pasting, hey, this is a low effort reply? I think that's where some of the humor comes from.
I think, yes, I think we're going to have to come up with a new strategy, because basically anytime I try to do education, we have a group of people who think it's really funny to then, there are already people who know the norms. They have a very high signal accounts. They posted a lot of quality stuff. And so what they do, as soon as I tell someone in an earnest way of being like, hey, maybe you should think about doing this, they just reply with that. And then I think it's very confusing for the people who are like, wait, so these high status people in the community are replying with the thing I did, is that okay? So I think we're going to come up with a more private notification system for people to nudge them in a direction of better behavior, because every time we do it publicly, it turns into a meme. Yeah, it's a fine balance, a fine line to walk, being earnest on the irony-rich environment of the internet, I think. So I applaud you for your efforts, sir. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of trial and error here. But yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is irony and sarcasm and inside jokes. That is extremely sophisticated, and I think it's really difficult for non-native English speakers or people who are maybe a little less online, who are just getting into things. That's actually quite intimidating, and it's not my place to tell people to not do that. So I think we just need to come up with better strategies where that can coexist. Yeah, man, I don't want to belabor this too much, but this is such a fascinating topic. I agree it's intimidating and maybe not welcoming, but by the same token, it's also what I love about crypto Twitter is all the memes and the inside jokes. It's sort of this in-group, out-group signaling. So yeah, a fine line to balance, as I said. Okay, Dan, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I so appreciate the time that you have given us. This has been absolutely fascinating. To conclude this, I just want to encourage people to head to farcaster.xyz. If you so choose, create a Farcaster account. If you do so, go ahead and follow the OP Stack channel and follow Optimism on Farcaster while you're at it. The handle is @Optimism. Anything else you want to tell the folks on OP Radio before we conclude this, Dan? No, thanks for having me. I love the questions, and it's great to see a whole bunch of familiar faces through the space. It kind of like, it's like your crew is sitting in the front while you're on stage. So it's nice to see a bunch of folks that I spent a lot of time on Farcaster with. That's always a nice confidence boost, isn't it? Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dan. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Remember, you can subscribe to OP Radio. These episodes get edited and uploaded to YouTube, to Spotify, Apple, Google, etc. You can even collect them on chain. Thanks once again, Dan. And thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your day and stay optimistic, y'all. We'll see you later. Cheers. Thanks for having me.